Good afternoon and welcome to the International House. I'm Ksenia Schmutz and I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies, and it's our absolute pleasure today to host Cassie Thornton in cooperation with LU Arts and Radar. As always, it's great to have so many of you in the house. It's a hybrid seminar. We have people online joining. In fact, one of our roundtable panelists is online today. Just a couple of house rules. So the conversation is recorded, but if we can't release it for whatever reason, just let us know. We can edit things, or we don't have to release it, although we, of course, would like to. Please feel free to join. For those of you online, we will be monitoring the chat. There is a Q&A section for you there. And without any further ado, I'll pass to Lucy for the introduction.
Thanks, Tanya. So I'm really delighted to welcome you today as part of Cassie Thornton's over there IES fellowship, which is focusing on strategies for practicing care amidst the ruins, thinking about how we can engage in acts of solidarity, of rest, and of vital healthcare when societal infrastructures fail. And I think whilst it feels like care has been widely spoken of in recent years, both within the arts and within academia, this is often kind of used as a bit of a smokescreen, detracting from infrastructures that are often far from caring. And I think for me, our speakers today engage with care in real terms as a complex, messy practice, but a vital one. Cassie's visit is also part of the Radar programme, Rehearsals for a World We Could Live In, which we've been launching over the past 2 weeks, and which works with artists and researchers whose work proposes new worlds or ways of living in this one. And in addition to artist Cassie Thornton, we're delighted to be hearing from 2 guest speakers today, Dr. Valeria Graziano, who is online, who's a researcher and one of the conveners of Pirate Care, a research project and network which stands for a common care infrastructure, and writer Evie Muir, whose work advocates for rest, healing and resistance as abolitionist practice. And we also are joined today by 3 of our brilliant Loughborough colleagues. We wanted to ground today's discussion in some of the research that is happening across the university on this topic. And so we'll start today by hearing from Dr. Jade French, Dr. Victoria Browne and Dr. Catherine Coveney. And just to say a bit about the structure of today, after hearing from the 3 of them, we'll then hear from Cassie, Evie and Valeria, and finally we'll have a Q&A session with all of our speakers. So I'm delighted to hand over to my colleagues, Jade, Victoria and Katie, who will introduce how their work aligns with the question of care in the ruins, from research in the health humanities, ageing studies and intergenerational care, to the politics of reproduction, the sociology of sleep and chronic illness, among many other things. Over to the 3 of you to introduce your research. You guys have not said who would go first. But Victoria, do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. All right. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I've written myself a script, and I'm just going to read it because my head is slightly all over the place in the middle of term, so it's going to take me a while to get in the zone. Okay. So my work is situated within feminist philosophy, in which care is something of an ever-present concern. But more specifically, I've been focused on the philosophy of pregnancy and reproductive politics over the past few years. So in my book, available in all good bookshops here, I explored why miscarriage has been such a stigmatized and neglected experience. And I tried to promote a full spectrum approach which treats all pregnancy outcomes, including abortion, miscarriage, stillbirth and live birth, as equally valid and worthy of care. And in the last chapter of the book particularly, I looked into ways of practicing full spectrum solidarity and care within societies like the US and the UK. And I came across the full spectrum doula movement in the US that aims to provide accessible doula care to any pregnant person, however their pregnancy proceeds or ends. So usually doulas, who are non-medical caregivers, attend to and advocate for a pregnant person as they prepare for and give birth, but the full spectrum doulas have expanded the definition and provide support for pregnant people, whatever kind of pregnancy or pregnancy ending they're experiencing. So for example, in their book, The Doulas, Radical Care for Pregnant People, Mary Mahoney and Lauren Mitchell describe how the Full Spectrum Doula Project that they co-founded in New York in 2007 emerged as a direct descendant of the reproductive justice framework developed in the 1990s by women of colour who sought to analyse and expose the intersections, including gender, race, sexual orientation, and access to resources that affect how a person makes decisions and whether that person has meaningful choices around reproductive health. Understanding systematic oppression, they write, is therefore crucial to the way that we approach doula care. So the reproductive justice framework also promotes the idea that abortion should not stand alone and instead be approached as one part of a person's entire reproductive life. The same individual may have an abortion, give birth, and then have a miscarriage, and support and care should be equally available in every case. The Jane Collective, which was an underground abortion network that operated in Chicago between 1969 and 1973, putting together pop-up abortion clinics in apartments and providing counselling and phone support, was also a major source of inspiration for the doula project. While private doula care is expensive and hence has become something of a boutique service for the privileged, the Full Spectrum Doula Project is run by a network of volunteers to ensure their services are free and accessible to low-income people and those without existing support structures. It is primarily a direct caregiving service that works with individuals to provide emotional and physical support, yet it also reaches way beyond the individual, weaving together pregnancy experiences into a holistic service and advocacy model that challenges stigmatized artificial divisions among pregnancy outcomes. That was a quote from Loretta Ross. And it builds alliances between direct caregiving and reproductive justice activism. So in my work, for example, in my book, I've highlighted the work of the Doula Project as a practical illustration of what full spectrum care can look like in action, and also other community-based doula networks led by women of colour in recent years, like the Black Doula Project in Maryland or Chicago Volunteer Doulas. Doulas Without Borders in the UK is another notable organisation working with marginalised and disadvantaged pregnant people, including refugees, asylum seekers and migrants who've been targeted by the UK's hostile environment.
Far from the table.
Okay, but as I've been researching these community-based groups, I've also had to grapple with the question of whether care has to depend on volunteer networks to fill the void created by neoliberal individualism and organised state abandonment. Initiatives like these rely on volunteers to ensure their services are free, and it enables them to cultivate non-hierarchical ways of organising care and support, away from paternalistic and bureaucratic state procedures. But Mahoney and Mitchell also acknowledged the limitations of volunteerism, given that taking time away from paid work is simply not an option for many people. And Jennifer Nash too, so I've put up her book on the slide there. In the book, she emphasises the tremendous physical, affective and spiritual labour of volunteer and precariously employed doulas who work without job security or adequate wages. And she argues that an overemphasis on volunteer or low-paid doulas as the answer to the problem of Black maternal mortality detracts from the true causes of the Black maternal health crisis. That's in inverted commas. For instance, she writes, this is a long quote, "The hospital all too often feels like a carceral space, subjecting birthing Black people to myriad forms of violent surveillance. Yet the current political attention to doulas suggests that Black birthing people simply need to hire doulas as bodyguards to protect them from the violence that masquerades as medical care. So it can't just be a matter of championing voluntary associations and care networks as the answer to the question of care in the ruins of neoliberal racial capitalism. And at some recent reproductive justice events that I've attended, I've started to notice a real ambivalence regarding the role of the state and what is demanded of it. In some visions of reproductive justice, there is at least an implicit assumption that reproductive justice requires some form of state socialism or social democracy to provide the basic infrastructure required for positive reproductive freedom to be realized. Yet other strands of reproductive justice activism adopt more of an anarchic DIY approach that sidesteps state provision altogether and invokes its abolition. Rodanti van der Waal, for example, so I've included her book there on the slide too, argues for reimagining and practicing reproductive justice as abolitionist care, grounded in the abolition of authoritative obstetric, terrible word to say, institutions and state control of reproduction. So she argues that attempted reforms of obstetric state institutions ignore and conceal the many solutions to obstetric violence and injustice that are already offered and practiced by pregnant and birthing people, midwives and activists, such as mutual aid and radical care within grassroots autonomous midwifery and doula care. And when we zoom in on these alternative forms of care, she claims, this is a quote, what emerges is an almost invisible but vast undercommons of care for childbirth. That is expressive of an abolitionist ethic of care, an ethic that is not trying to reform the obstetric institution, but that has a vision of its abolition, and with that, a vision of a different world altogether. Pregnant people, midwives, and doulas, Rodanti writes, thus become the body that replaces the solidarity and trust that connects people to the national community of the caring democracy through the establishment of an underground communal substitute responsible for and expressive of the moral good when it comes to the realization of respectful maternity care and reproductive and birth justice. So I'm interested now in my work in thinking about this idea of the reproductive undercommons as a replacement or substitute, as Rodanti explains it. And though it's an exciting and persuasive idea, I'm also wondering if it kind of lets the state and its institutions off the hook. And I'm also wondering if we really do want to abandon appeals to the state, or at least to a different kind of imagined state, given its potential role in bringing about wealth redistribution, which is a vital component of social justice. So what I want to explore now is the relationship between visions of reproductive justice rooted in some kind of state socialist tradition and visions coming more from anarchist or abolitionist traditions, and think about how these different strands interact with one another and also potentially diverge. Thank you.
So, hello. Thanks, Victoria and Jade. I'm probably going to ramble now and just try and respond to some of the things that, that you've said. So I'm Dr. Catherine Coveney. I'm a sociologist here at Loughborough, and I'm doing some work on care that I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects that I'm working on at the moment. So there's 3 projects that I have that are kind of around care. So the first is the Living with Noonan Syndrome project. So this is where I've been working with parents of children with a rare genetic condition called Noonan syndrome and interviewing them about their experiences, their everyday experiences of caregiving. And as part of this project, it overlaps a little bit with what Victoria was saying. So part of it, we've been thinking about reproductive justice and how kind of parents can be empowered to choose disability, because I think that's often a very difficult choice. So to parent children with disability with dignity as part of that conversation around reproductive justice. The second project is Rhythms of Aging, Disability and Care. And this we're doing at the moment. So we're running workshops and focus groups with parents of disabled children, but also people who care for older adults as well. So we're looking at care more kind of across the spectrum. So connecting a bit with Jade's work as well. So this is underway. And then I have a new project starting in January, which is specifically about trying to understand the care and support needs of African and African Caribbean people in the UK who are living with dementia. And this is a group that often quite absent from formal care structures. So part of the project is looking at that, like how can this group be better cared for? And I think it connects with a lot with what you were saying, Jade, around trust, around institutions, around what the history of institutions, especially institutional racism. Some of the people we've spoken to during the development of the project proposal said things like, you know, I couldn't go into a care home because then I'd have to live with those people who have subjected me to racism my whole life. I'd be side by side with them. I wouldn't feel safe in those spaces. So kind of some of the background to that project. But thinking, I'll kind of skip this one a bit. So thinking about care, I've been quite influenced by Joan Tronto's work. I think she gives us a really nice framework to think about care in different ways and its different guises. And I've been kind of using that as a way in to thinking about how care comes into my data. I'll wait till you've taken photos. Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking about care in all of these ways. So not just caregiving, but also care receiving, and care as being an embodied material, and especially an effective practice. So how care comes into my data, mainly it's in terms of kind of everyday care. So thinking about interpersonal relationships, thinking about acts of caregiving, about this caring for, caring about, and actually practically providing care. It also is in relation to how these practices are very much entangled with our formal health and social care systems and structures, and the relationships that people have with different professionals and how that influences who gives care and perceptions of good care and bad care. And finally, in terms of self-care as well, so care for others, especially if you're caring for a relative with dementia or a disabled child, that care can become all-consuming for people, for family carers, and their self-care, their own health and their own well-being can often take a backseat. So there's often very little room for self-care in people's lives. So I've been thinking a lot about what I've called the choreographies of care. So there's kind of like shifting, messy spaces and places and routines and rhythms of care that characterize our everyday lives, and how people manage to juggle complex medical, social, educational and emotional care needs all at the same time. So I quite like this quote from Andrew Johnson. So he is a disability studies scholar, but he's also the father of a disabled child as well. And he writes very much about this, about how when you're a carer, the rhythms, the taken for granted rhythms of life are being broken. And then the second thing I'm thinking about in my work is what I've called the chronopolitics of care. So chronopolitics refers to the politics of time, so the temporal organisation of our everyday lives, the things that enable us to feel in sync with others, enable us to participate in everyday life in a meaningful way. So in terms of my data so far, and this is where the care in the ruins bit, I think, comes into this. So what I've found through talking to parent carers especially is that care, kind of, especially in terms of formal care systems, it's characterized by waiting and scarcity. They're kind of the defining features of our formal healthcare systems. So the families I've spoken to feel like they have to fight all the time. They're fighting for these limited resources. And we can see this playing out across different domains. So in relation to access to medical care, where people are fighting for access to medical appointments, to see their GP, to get a paediatrician, also for treatments, for expensive medical therapies and things. So they're fighting in that respect, but also in terms of the lack of social care. So fighting for just somebody to take notice and somebody to help. And especially in terms of parents for younger children, fighting for their educational needs to be recognised and to be supported. So there's a limited funding and limited places for children with special educational needs and disabilities in our schools, and there's a lack of appropriate school places that can meet these children's needs. So parents are just fighting all the time. They're fighting for the care for their loved ones that they feel that they need to survive, let alone to thrive. They feel like everything is left to them. So it's a very individualized process. So families feel that they're alone in these fights. They've become very socially isolated and excluded, feeling like they don't quite fit in anywhere, and they're trying to, fight against other families for these limited resources. And then in terms of carers, then they feel like there's no time out. They have no time away from their caring responsibilities. There's no time to rest, to recharge. They're constantly tired, they're fatigued, they're burnt out, and there's nowhere to turn. So it's quite a very sad story. So what can we do to help? So looking to the future, I've been really inspired by the concept of crip time that was proposed by Alison Kafer, a critical disability studies scholar. And she's talking through this concept about a more kind of flexible reimagining of how time works, and seeing crip time as both a theory and a practice to account for how disabled people experience life at a different pace. So some things need to be slowed down. So for example, if you're in chronic pain, you might need more rest breaks, or you might need to move more slowly, whereas other things you might need speeding up. So you might have to eat at specific times, or need breaks to go to the loo or whatever, to you've got to keep a track of things more accurately than other people. And there's often much more care to fit into the 24-hour day. When you're managing pain, you're attending medical appointments, you're dealing with medications and medical devices, all that extra planning that you have to do around travel, how you get places, and all that disability-related admin. So Kafer argues that her kind of famous quote, that we should bend time to meet disabled bodies, kind of shattering our traditional notions of productivity and time, where crip time can be a form of self-care. So as we learn how to exist and how to navigate an ableist world. So kind of ending with some questions as well, thinking, when we change temporalities and new forms of care and connection develop. So that's something I'm thinking about. And also thinking about care as a collective responsibility. So, what changes do we need? What wider structural and political infrastructures and resources are necessary to kind of lay the ground for more caring societies? And, can we shift our thinking away from care as dependence, as reliance, towards those notions of interdependence, and in a more kind of relational sense? And yeah, that's thank you.
So yeah, delighted to have Cassie here, who's been here this week as an IAS visiting fellow. Cassie is an artist, writer, and organizer who makes a safe space for the unknown, for disobedience, and for unanticipated collectivity. In her recent work, she explores the struggle of reorganizing and using privilege in the apocalypse. He uses social practices, including institutional critique, insurgent architecture, and healing modalities like hypnosis and yoga to find soft spots in the hard surfaces of capitalist life. And I love that sentence. It feels very fitting for our conversation today.
Cassie has invented a grassroots alternative credit reporting service for survivors of gentrification, has hypnotized hedge fund managers, has finger painted with the grime found inside banks, has donated cursed paintings to profiteering bankers, and has taught feminist economics to yogis and vice versa. She is currently a co-organizer of a bar that is an undercover clinic in Berlin, and her 2020 book, The Hologram, Feminist Peer-to-Peer Health for a Post-Pandemic Future, is available on Future Press. Over to you, Cassie.
Thank you. Hey. I was wondering like if we could just do like one little tiny writing exercise. I'm really curious. Sometimes when I know like when we're in a space where we're all thinking about something, sometimes we forget that it's actually also in our life. So I wonder if everybody could get out a piece of paper or you can type on your computer just for like about 2 minutes, just write like for you, like what is the crisis of care? Like what is the crisis of care like in your life, or what do you think about it? What do you feel about it? Just anything. And I'm gonna put a timer on because I love that. Hopefully everybody had a chance to just like remember who they are and where they are. So, I think I updated the file a little bit since you downloaded it.
Oh,
Is it,
refresh it.
is it possible to refresh it?
Yeah, if you're the latest.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
That's funny. Okay. I think it's very similar to what I had. So I want to talk about the hologram because it's what's useful. And I would say that like when I talk about the hologram, I often end up just explaining what it is and how it works because most people just like actually kind of need it. My goal is that I would love to talk about like what can we build once we actually experience anti-capitalist care and interdependence? Like, what does it make possible? Because I actually think that like the hologram is a really interesting project, but it's a path and not a destination. And like, of course, like we are always in process, and processes are what make our lives and make the world. But like I also want to go somewhere. Like I want things to change. And I think I want us to think a little bit about if the hologram could actually help us think a little bit bigger about what needs to happen in the world and not just in our lives, and not just make us feel better in the apocalypse. So the goal of the hologram is actually that all caretakers are cared for. And if we go from there, like I think it might look a little bit different. So I'm introducing it that way in a way where I don't often do, but I think in this room maybe we can play with that. I'm gonna go back to this video at the end, if it'll let me. So we already talked about what is the crisis of care. And I think it's interesting, depending on where we ask that question, sometimes people think about this in a very abstract kind of societal way. But then I think what the thing about healthcare or about health or about care is that it really touches every single person's life. And so when we talk about like these kind of big crises of care, I feel like it's hard to do like the macro and the micro. But when we talk about, I think when we talk about the crisis of care in our own lives, like, I mean, just for example, I live in Germany. I've lived there for about 3 years. I don't actually know how to really use that medical system in any way. And if you talk to anybody that is not a native German person, most of us just don't know how. And most of us live without healthcare in that way. And I think that like, depending on who you speak to and what situation we're in, like the way our versions of the crisis of care are all these kind of different ways into like the crisis of care, but they're all relevant. And yeah, our personal experience of it is just like, it is our research in a way. The hologram is, I think it is what this says, a practice, a community and research about how peer support rebuilds trust and begins to construct a network of transformation that can end interdependence that can outlast capitalism. And I think that the hologram is also a practice for proving that there is a situation that is possible in which all caregivers are cared for, and that is built into the process of receiving care. And I wanted to start with just this thing that I think has come up for so many years. And this is just the question of like, why is it so hard to ask for help? And so when we, because the hologram is run by many, many people, but when we run a workshop or a course, we usually do a kind of intake survey. And we ask people to imagine themselves in a couple of situations and then tell us how they feel. And I think these are quite like cute and funny and a little bit ironic, but will help us kind of think about why it's so hard to ask for help. So we give people this sort of like spectrum of answers. So they can answer like from anywhere from like, I will not do this to like, hell yeah, no problem. And so we ask something like, how do you feel when you imagine asking for 2 hours of someone's time to focus on you? And obviously the number one response is that they're worried about the impact on others. But I think it's really interesting, like there's a good amount of people that are hopeful. Not one person says that it's no problem. But among a lot of people, and I would say this was surveys like when I put these together, this was probably 3 years into the project, and I would say maybe with 250 responses or something. But at this point, there were still people who had signed up for the hologram that says, I will not do this. Okay, how do you feel when you imagine asking for support for a year from 3 people? The number one answer is that they're anxious and overwhelmed, but there are people that are excited about it. And I mean, amazingly, a couple people, probably like 20 people said, no problem. But again, you have at least half almost, or whatever, a good number of people, not half, but many people say, again, I will not do this, even though that's what they're literally going to join the course about. And now we have, how do you feel when you're asked for help from one of your friends? No problem. Like, and I think this is really interesting. Like this is like, this seems really important to pay attention to, like in our personal lives and at a systems level. Actually, like supporting other people is a kind of amazing process, especially when there is some kind of container around it. And not all care can be contained, of course, but I think this is really important, and it's kind of like a spectacularly funny part of being a human in our societies right now, is that it feels really, really hard to ask for help. And I think this is why the hologram is basically a research project that has proven again and again that the people that do the most care work in the world are the people that have the hardest time asking for support and are often the most unsupported people. And we know there's so many reasons for this, but here it is. Let's get that. So I think a really big question for me has become like, what would happen in a world where all caregivers were cared for? Like we would actually have to rearrange every part of our society. And this would be a great project. Okay, so I'm just going to do a really quick overview of what the hologram is and where it comes from, because where things come from really matters. And the hologram comes from a crisis, and I think it can thus be really useful in crisis. So in the 2010s, Greece is going bankrupt and their borders are open and there's a big influx of migrants escaping war. And the response to austerity is that there are about 60 free clinics that opened all over Greece. And they're run by volunteers, by doctors, by people like NGOs, religious organizations, anarchists. They're famously some in squats, some in municipal buildings. But I heard about this as like a rumor that there was one particular clinic that was offering not just free care, but like experimental care. Like they wanted to not just reproduce the medical system, but see if they could do it better and kind of like work with some of the hierarchies that are kind of native to medical care. And so they were doing all these experiments in how to confront hierarchy. And so they were doing this one project, and it was such a novel idea to me. All I heard was, you would go into this one clinic in Thessaloniki and you'd be seen by a doctor, a social worker, and a therapist at the same time. And I was just like, what? Like, I'm from the US, like I can barely see one doctor for more than 4 minutes. And so you would be seen by these 3 people for an hour and a half. Those 3 people ask you questions. One is obviously asking you about your body, and one is asking you, questions like the social worker might ask you about your working conditions, your food, your money. Therapists might be talking to you about like your emotions, your family dynamics. But not only do you see yourself as the person receiving all that care and see all these different dimensions of yourself, but also like the therapist is getting to see all these other sides of you as well. So like instead of just finding out that you have anxiety and trying to tap into why, they can also see like maybe there's actually like a very good like anatomical reason why, and that could be very related to a work situation or your lack of money. And so like I think this is this really interesting shift in what care can look like. And so we got the word hologram because a therapist that had worked on the project for a long time, who developed the integrative model that I'm talking about, she had told me that as a therapist within this project, she saw people as a hologram and not as a flat piece of paper, and that this was really a big deal for her. So it doesn't just change the person receiving the care, it also really changes the caregivers themselves and what's possible for them. I think it's also important to say that they don't call the patient they don't call the person receiving care a patient, they call them an incomer. And I think in so many different ways, they wanted to sort of destabilize a lot of the sort of habits that we have in the medical system. One of them being that if you're coming in as a patient, that you're like less than, you're less than the doctor, that you're, invalid or something like that. And so just to kind of like begin with renaming everything to kind of de-habitualize some of the patterns that we have in that space. This project still goes on. The hologram just got translated to Greek, and next month we'll go for like the sort of release of the Greek book. And the people that started this clinic wrote the introduction, and I don't know what it says. I know generally, but so I mean, basically what happened is that I grew up in the US, and I spent a lot of time with a lot of different collectives trying to figure out what we could do to produce the hologram or the integrative model in the US. And that was obviously not super likely, because how would we get any experts or space or money to do what we had seen happen in Greece? And so what ended up happening is that we began to experiment on each other. And this really is through so many different groups of people, individuals, friends, professional environments, unprofessional environments, that the practice that we have now kind of has come through. And so the most basic idea is that the person is called the hologram who's receiving the care. The hologram invites 3 people to support them in a ritual that happens regularly. These 3 people ask them questions. One asks them mental and emotional questions, one asks social questions, and one asks physical questions. And we do this over time. So I'm a hologram. I have 3 people that I meet with every season. One person always asks me social stuff. One person always asks me physical stuff. One always asks me mental and emotional stuff. And after 4 years of meeting every season, it's kind of scary how much they know about me. And it's a real adjustment. And I think it's really amazing. And now each of those 3 people also has 3 people. So a big part of the project is actually like making sure that the people that support you have support. So when we do this, the incomer that was at the Greek clinic, we call that person the hologram. We see them as an expert about their own health. They're the storyteller, and they're also a teacher, because they show us that it is possible to ask for support and to be vulnerable and also articulate your needs. I think it's a really good practice space for practicing saying yes, saying no, and saying when things are working, saying when things are not working. And maybe we can take this out of the hologram as well. The triangle members They are curious non-experts. They're people that are there to ask questions, and I think like the most important thing is that they never give advice. And there is actually kind of a hierarchy in the hologram, but if anything, it is that the hologram has a little bit more power because we want to reverse the hierarchy that we know in medicine. And so they do the opposite of what we would do in the medical field, in that they are not trying to solve any problems. They're not trying to fix anything. If anything, the systems are broken, the humans aren't. And so we try to look at it that way. We use this idea of like critical feeling with that comes from disability justice, which is like, you know, like it goes along with this idea of not trying to solve anybody's problems. Like, I think the task of the triangle members is actually to just get really close to the hologram to sort of see how they feel. And then like, if they get close enough, they might even understand like why they might feel that way. And from there, I think they can be present with the hologram as the hologram lives. And when the hologram needs to make decisions, when they hit a wall, when they, as they change, they have 3 people that actually know their journey. And the triangle members take mad notes. And so like, I think that the amazing thing about this is that we can kind of be archivists for each other. So like over time, you know, I'm in many people's holograms, and I have a notebook or maybe 5 notebooks for each of them. And I can see how they've changed over time. I can see the patterns, and I can help them see the patterns that they live in. And this can be really life-changing just to be seen in this way. So the art of endurance is a really big part of this process. And I think like over the years, what we've realized is that there's a lot to sticking with a practice over time and seeing where it goes. And now we ended up with this PowerPoint that's from last year, but now there's a lot of people that have been practicing for 4 years. And so now we can see what happens when you have to, not when you have to, no one has to do anything in this process, but when you choose to stay together and work through things for a few years, when we actually start to know each other over time, when we're committed to each other in a non-economic, non-family, non-work relationship, like it's like a whole other relationship. And we can see that it does a lot of things. And it's interesting to get to do something like this. And there's all these amazing things that you all have said about time today. And I think that like our relationship to time in this project is very much about stealing time from the global economy to spend on each other, and doing that in a way that feels like it makes sense to us. And in a weird way, like, yeah, I think it's like, it really is very much about putting a cog in the gears of like what we believe makes us good people or something, you know, like less about a certain level of productivity, less about a kind of individual survival, and much more about just actually like having really specific, very formal time for your friends. Recently, like someone had said that they started to call in sick when their friends were sick, and I felt like we really made it. Like, so yeah, in a larger project, the idea would be that it spreads virally. So you have like the person in the center would be the biggest circle, has 3 people that support them, and then they make sure that the people that are supporting them have 3 people or have some other form of support. And this is this mechanic in the project that I think now we've tested in so many different ways, but like, this is what works. It's like, it really doesn't rotate. It's like, I have 3 people and I make sure those 3 people have support, and they make sure their 3 people have support. And so like, there's so many other different versions of pods, of circles, and I believe that all of those are valuable in different ways, but it's really specific to this kind of rhizome, and making sure that all the people have support, but that you can give and receive support without having debt involved, which I'm going to say more about in a second. Yeah, and so then I think the other thing that we've realized is really important is that like when you're supporting somebody, it can be incredibly valuable to understand that they're also supporting someone else. And I think it's like knowing that we are creating like a culture of care where like we are all manufacturing, giving, receiving, producing care in a multitude of ways. It's like, it feels much different than kind of isolated like care when you know like I don't know, like when you go to a therapist and it's like out over here outside of the rest of your life. It's just very different to like actually sow the seeds for like a network. And I know like me and Lucy were talking about today, sort of at the beginning of the project, like I really felt like all of a sudden I could sleep better because I knew when all my friends started practicing that like everybody had something. And something that I think is actually quite good, not just like anything. And yeah, and I think so this is about like sort of producing culture and not just individual moments. Most of my work in my life has been as an anti-debt activist and artist too, but I think this project is very importantly based on the idea of like you get to give somebody support without expecting anything back, which I think when you just say that from the beginning makes it way easier. You're just going to give to them. And actually the giving is pleasurable. So I don't think it's not a minus on the bank account of energy in any way. But I think maybe more important and more difficult for many people is that actually it also means that at some point you are going to receive support without giving back, without going into debt to somebody. I think this is very important, and so especially I think those of us that live in colonial, highly financialized cultures where like the only thing we've ever gotten comes with a debt. So this requires a real exorcism. Let's see. Yeah, yeah, we got the wrong PowerPoint here. So I'm gonna just say the rest, which is, okay, wait, actually, I'm gonna start with one other thing we saw here. So the community of practice is a sort of secret sauce to the hologram. Like the hologram, I think it's so easy to think about this like small group work being the work of the hologram. But I don't think that anybody creates new habits or does weird stuff alone. So like the hologram, it produces, it's like it's kind of a third space in a weird way. It's like, it's not your family, it's not work, it's not going to the doctor, it's not going to therapy, and it's not hanging out with your friends. It's another part of your life and it's another relationship. And in order to make space for this, I think it's really helpful to know other people are doing it and also to get to like reflect on it together because it is weird. And it's like a special kind of conversation that we don't really do in our lives. And so the community of practice is this group that has met online every month since 2020. And now there's 3 of them that happen online a month. 1 is Spanish speaking and 2 are English speaking, different time zones because there's people around the world that are coming. And this is a place where you basically get to talk about how it's going in the hologram, or in general, how it's going in your sort of like care practices, whatever that means. And this has been so amazing. And it's actually, I mean, I haven't been going recently because I'm just busy, but it's just like maybe my favorite part of the hologram, and it doesn't often get described as a part of the hologram, but I think it's really, really important. Basically, the people that attended over time, the community of practice, formed a group, which is now called UG, which is like an assembly of people that gave away all of our money. And gave away all of our money, I think really importantly, to projects around the world where people could take the hologram and apply it in their own context and do what they felt like with it. And we were able to fund that because I wrote a book and some people gave us money for it. And so this has been really amazing because this meant that we could fund people to do what we wanted or what they wanted, which meant a big group of a collective of people from around South America translated the hologram to Spanish in a very radical way. And now we're distributing it through collectives. It also meant that a Greek translation of the hologram got to come out with quite a cool pair of Planeta books with a cool publisher, but also translated in a way that we believed in, with people that have been practicing the hologram for a long time. It's meant that this group masculiminal formed, which is like a regular meeting for people that identify as masculine to use the hologram. Lots of different stuff has happened where people have like gotten to kind of like take and pull the hologram into their own dimension and use it. And so now the hologram is pretty much out of money, but is very much alive in lots of different worlds. And so now it's sort of like, let's see what happens. We opened a school for social medicine in Berlin, which has now we got a space and we run a bar called the Casino for Social Medicine. And this was our original brochure. And what else do I want to say about any of this stuff here? That's the protocol. I would say the one other thing I really wanted to talk about just briefly is that is this thing that I had said before about like how the hologram can be used. And I think that like the possibility of the hologram, it takes using it to understand like what it can create. But I wanted to like walk you through a couple of things that have been tried and a couple of things that we're working on because I think it might jog your imagination as well. So imagine that there is a direct action kind of climate group happening, and they might be, or maybe they're like a pro-Palestinian group in Germany, and they want to attack arms manufacturers. And say those people are very likely to be arrested repeatedly. Well, what if that social movement had a sort of a care infrastructure in from the beginning where the people that are going to be taking these kinds of risks have 3 people that are supporting them who are not going to take their eyes off of them, and those people also have support. Like, what if that was built in from the beginning? So we've done workshops, and we continue to work on this idea, which is really hard to implant inside of a direct action social movement because it's almost antithetical to this type of work. But I think that there's a lot to this type of idea being built into social movements. And so one thing that we have tried is like hunger strikers. Like, imagine that there's somebody that needs to go on hunger strike or wants to go on hunger strike, and they have support from people in quite a formal way, and that we know those people also have support, and then those people's supporters have support. Like, it's such a different look to a social movement. Another way that the hologram gets used a lot is like within institutions and organizations. So like we have like these kind of communities that know each other, that might know each other's work. But like there's maybe not like a deep understanding of what we're really doing, or we're not able to slow down enough to actually see what the sort of like social weather systems are underneath the group. Like, it's very interesting to actually use the hologram within pre-existing groups to kind of like manage what's going on. So I don't know, there's a lot of different, I think, examples that we could use, but I just want to plant the fact that like, I think that the hologram can create people who are hard to fuck with because they have support and their supporters have support. And it means that we can take risks. And I think that the way that the world is going, we want to be able to take really deliberate risks at certain points in our life, at whatever level, whatever risk means to you. And what I'm working on right now, and what I'll do at the end of this week, is just about to launch a pretty big research project where we're going to send out a survey to all the people that we don't know that do the hologram to kind of begin to gather some information about what that has been like, what has allowed them to do, how they've hacked it, what kind of obstacles they've faced. And so that will be, actually, the survey will come to all of you as well, for anybody that has now tried it. We'd really love to hear from you. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Actual video or?
That's okay.
Yeah, I know that I'm sure people have a lot of questions and things coming up, but we're gonna keep going. And so our next speaker is Evie is author of Radical Rest, Notes on Burnout, Healing and Hopeful Futures, and founder of Peaks of Colour, a Peak District-based nature for healing community group by and for people of colour. Their work sits on the intersections of gendered, racial and land justice, and seeks to nurture survivors' joy, rest, hope and imagination as Black feminist and abolitionist praxis. I'm really happy that you're doing this.
Thanks for having me. I don't have any slides.
Can we put something, do you want to share my
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just thinking so we don't just have. Valeria might not want to be.
Yeah, I don't have any slides and I was explaining to Lisa, just moved house. So I've got a couple of notes just to go back to. Hi. Yeah, as Lucy mentioned, we have radical rights, which came out earlier this year and is still mind-blowing to me that it exists. And Radical Rest really explores activist burnout and conversely rest as lenses which we can understand our social health and communal needs through, and to really understand how capitalism and racial capitalism specifically is impacting us on such an embodied level. And in the book, it's interesting because to come after so many other speakers, because there's so many links. In the book, each chapter is an emotion, and really tries to explore that embodied element of something that, in my experience in organising spaces, is just rife. There really isn't any organiser that I know within my ecosystems that I feel could say they aren't burnt out at the minute. And yet it's said so flippantly and so casually. And I was really interested in those conditions of which we do our work within. And I feel like I've been working in organising spaces and organising from a place of racial justice and land justice and gender justice for over 10 years now. And whilst I was building Peaks of Colour, I guess one of my biggest preoccupations was around how we do the work, not what we do, and ensuring that those structures and infrastructures and foundations are careful and restful, and how can we ensure that we are doing this rigorous work, how we're doing these direct actions, how we're building communities, whilst also ensuring that collectively we feel cared for. So in coming here today, I really could have spoken to this topic of living amidst the ruins through multiple different lenses in the book. Yeah, I interviewed 20 Black and queer disabled activists across the UK, and in the Radical Abundance chapter, I interviewed someone called Eshiki Mizura, who is based in Nottingham and is also a doula, and interviewed them specifically through the lens of care, community care, within Black communities. So that could have been one lens. Also interviewed people around health and anxiety, and there were so many different lenses, but given where we are, I thought it was really timely and important to kind of ground that in the institution of education as a whole, and in terms of everything that everyone's spoken about today, and I'm sure everyone's work and research and practices beyond this, thinking about the university and wider education systems, particularly in the UK, as whether it's a potential site for care or not, and therefore then what is our roles in that. So alongside the chapters which are based around emotions, there's also 4 case studies in the book, and they are based around institutions that I argue are really sites of burnout. So there's the home, there's education, there's the charity industrial complex, and there's healthcare. And those 4, alongside the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex, which I just didn't have the word count to include, I believe that particularly when we're talking about living amidst the ruins, that these should be the ruins that we are talking about. These are the infrastructures that should be toppled, that should be, we should be reimagining and considering building from and beyond. So I just want to read a quote from bell hooks. And actually, maybe before I do that, just to kind of, introduce my positionality in this. So my background, I'm from Sheffield, but was born and raised in Doncaster, which is a really working class town in South Yorkshire, and was raised in a really working class area called Hexthorpe, went to a really working class school called Bobbycar, although it's now an academy, which is a whole other conversation. And that school now actually was awarded a very prestigious award of having the most exclusions in the country a few years back, which again is a whole other conversation. And yeah, I was a really academic kid, and went to uni, did a master's and an undergrad, and got the highest score in my undergrad dissertation, and really did thrive and was able to exist within and navigate a capitalist education system. And yet now my work is really concerned with critiquing all those systems, including education. And I think the reason why I did thrive in that space at that time was because I found particularly sociological studies a really useful tool for understanding the world that we live in and my positionality in that world. But it's been 10 years since I went to uni, and constantly reflect on the fact that in that 8 years of study, I had no racial justice theory taught to me or us as a cohort at all in those 8 years. So my personal practice is really rooted in Black feminist theory, and that was both self-taught and community taught, and really rooted in that grassroots praxis of applying theory to our lived experiences, and then allowing the theory that comes from that to inform our organising. And I think this bell hooks quote really speaks to my relationship with theory in this way. Let me just find it. So she writes, I found a place of sanctuary in theorising, in making sense of what was happening. I found a place where I could imagine possible futures, a place where life would be lived differently. This lived experience of critical thinking, of reflection and analysis became a place where I worked at explaining the hurt and making it go away. Fundamentally, I learned from this experience that theory could be a healing place. And yeah, I suppose in us considering what alternative care structures are, I feel like this quote really allows us to ground our understanding of education as a system in something beyond research, in something beyond exams and grades and institutions, and such a powerful institution as universities, into a site of radical imagination. And I think a big reason for why the education system as it stands in the West has been so dangerous in a sense is because it prioritizes the head over the body and the thinking knowledge over the embodied knowledge. And particularly when we consider burnout and our and the enemy that we are collectively feeling, I think that in particular is one of the biggest contributions to our collective and individual disembodiment, disassociation, disconnection. So really, when I was writing the book, I was so conscious to interview organisers and activists and artists who are thinking beyond the parameters of our current status quo, both in their work and in what they're imagining for our communities in the future. And in the education case study, I interviewed someone called Anna Goodfellow, who was 17 at the time of me interviewing them. They are just a jack of all trades. They run an organisation called Neuromancers. They have self-published a book within a self-created publishing company that they built themselves. And among other things, they're also an actor who starred in like the great and actual real programs. And they coined a theory and a terminology called disobediency. And this is grounded essentially in the idea that children are the most oppressed group in the world, in society, in a Western society, largely because of the lack of agency and the lack of kind of institutionalized power that young people can wield. And from that point of theorizing, they bring in this idea of disobedience as a way of reimagining what knowledge making could look like from the positionality of a young person. Similarly, I interviewed someone called Olaf Fagerbone, who is an organizer in Sheffield, and they run an organisation called Zest for You that supports people experiencing menopause and over. And in the interviews with both of those people, we consider what education could look like from both the positionality of elders and young people. And then similarly drawing on Indigenous methodologies and lived experiences to understand wisdom in a different way beyond that of a formalized formal institution, to understanding the wisdom of our bodies and the wisdom of our land as equally important teachers. So I think when we're talking about care and living amongst the ruins and building something from the ruins of this very institution that we're in, it would be really interesting to consider what care could look like and what education as a space looks like in facilitating our understanding of that care. Because the reality has to be that post-apocalypse, post-revolution, institutions such as the university can't exist or shouldn't be existing as they currently are. And therefore our roles in that must look different too. So I've also got a few questions to end on. And they are really pulling again from that Black feminist legacy, particularly from a writer and organizer called Saidiya Hartman, who writes so much of the work of oppression is policing the imagination. And I think, especially when we talk about that disconnection between the mind and the body, and how from that place of burnout we're so preoccupied by our current state of survival and just getting through each day, just getting through each hour, and how burnout really we're unable to imagine anything beyond the current parameters of our present conditions. And I felt like that was a really important point of analysis, because who benefits from that? From us being so inactive. And it can only be the powers that be, it can only be the state, it can only be our oppressors who benefit from our inaction. So off the back of that, I'd like to pose some prompts. And the invitation isn't to necessarily answer them right now. Maybe write them down and take them away, and maybe consider looking for the answers to these prompts in non-traditional, non-academic spaces. It might be through speaking with your community, accessing oral histories and narratives, could be visualization, embodied practices, creative, holistic, artistic expressions, nature connection, talking to a tree, touching grass, as they say. but wondering, what does education as an alternative structure of care look like when young people are centred as a source of wisdom? What does education as an alternative structure of care look like when our elders are centred as a source of wisdom? What does education as an alternative structure of care look like when our bodies are centred as a source of wisdom? And what does education as an alternative structure of care look like when the land is centred as a source of wisdom? And before I wrap up, I just want to end on a quote by Paulo Freire, to, yeah, hopefully end on this like hopeful idea of something beyond what is. He says, there is no such thing as a neutral education process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes a practice of freedom, the means by which people deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world.
We have our last speaker who hopefully Hi, Valeria. I'll just introduce you briefly. Valeria Graziano is a cultural theorist, educator, and organizer based in Croatia. I think that's still accurate. Her research is rooted in collective practice and centers on strategies of work refusal, the commoning of social reproduction, and the politics of pleasure. Valeria's work has been published widely, and her book Pirate Care acts against the criminalization of solidarity, co-authored with Marcel Mars and Tomislav Medak, is forthcoming from Pluto Press in 2025. Welcome, Valeria, and I hope that you've been able to see and hear all of what we've been talking about, hopefully. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yes, really warm thanks to all involved in bringing this event to life. I'm sorry I cannot join you there in person in UK, even though I was based there for almost 20 years. But I'll say I just closed one of the two projects that I hope to share with you to contribute with this discussion, and we just closed it a day ago. So I'm a bit spent, and hopefully this will result in a more colloquial way of exposing some ideas that came to mind that might fit well. But I really look forward to the collective conversations, even though I'm trapped in a screen. I also want to note, though I'm not fairly sure, but I suspect that it'd be worth starting by noting the gender composition of the room anytime there is care in the title. It's like magic that happens. Hi, everyone. I hope I'm not too big as a television entity. Okay, so I will briefly share some ideas connected with two projects. I hate to define projects because I think they're more like processes. I don't know where they are going to end or what is the end point or aim. I think they're life practices, as Cassie was also mentioning. I think they all come from communities of practice in a constant effort to find each other and losing grounds and hacking them back together. The first project is called Pirate Care. This is also the storytelling that happens in this book. And the other one is called Figure It Out, the art of living through system failures. And this is somehow one way we present it cheekily is the prequel. Like we went a bit Hollywood, but it's somehow an exploration of different forms of illegalisms that I think would be worthwhile considering and maybe becoming more attentive to in our conversations around care and politics of care. Okay, so I can maybe share my screen, or maybe not, because it doesn't seem to be happening. Okay, then I will share the links in the chat of the Zoom, so people are able to maybe. Okay, so the gist of the proposal of Pirate Care. Pirate Care comes out as a project trying to connect different kinds of militant practices that myself and my motley crew of collaborators thought that it would be important both to connect amongst each other, but also to discuss as a whole, to see, because I think they reflect our present through and giving us some clues as to maybe what is to be done, or one of the many things that could be done. Thank you. So, and with the term Pirate Care, we wanted to describe a new kind of activism that we think it's emerging and it's confronting our present moment. So going a bit beyond the idea of mutual aid, this kind of activism starts with the implication that it's quite uncomfortable maybe as a starting point, but I think can carry our weight forward. That as we engage in social reproduction labor, aka everything we do to sustain our lives every day and intergenerationally in our human and more than human world, also means that we are involved in reproducing and socially reproducing capitalist relations. Okay, so we do not have, unfortunately, a lived experience of care beyond this mess in which we are, the ruins, I think, that you are evoking in your title. So hence to start there means to recognize that we cannot start from positions of purity or of having it figured it out, maybe fully, but also that there is something to be learned by looking at practices that begin by acknowledging that they move on the terrain of, let's call it the enemy, or the opposite forces of a contradictory ideas onto social hierarchy, and how this labor of care that is incessant and necessary for life needs to be carried out and divided. And this is the figure of the pirate evoked in the book, in our project, which is hopefully also a bit playful, but also perhaps sensitizing, in the sense that we have looked and spent some time with the storytellings, the fragments of histories that we do receive from pirates in the golden era and beyond, who were incredible storytellers and really confronting the rise of the global empire, this system of global capitals, colonial exploitation, extractivism, and patriarchy becoming essentially interlocked on a planetary scale, maybe for the first time in recorded history. And so these classical pirates, if you think of the stereotype that we even receive surviving in visual culture, is someone who has on their body the signs of struggle. The patch on the eye, it could be a hook on their limbs, or a wooden peg for a leg, etc. And this is an interesting starting point, because immediately gives us a story that we may not be so aware of the fact that these pirates embody a figure of a combatant, but also a person who received care by their comrades, but also someone who gave care in return. So they are very much, their existence bears the traces of very complex relations of struggle, but also care and support. So this new activism that we want to chart starts from the figure of the pirate, but also the carer as someone that we want to insert, again, trying to complicate some of the very important feminist inheritance that we have, who many before me or us, I think, did the great effort, in better terms that I could ever recapture here, of explaining how much care needs to be understood as labor. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. I think the presentations before really spoke to that in much more situated terms when it comes to elderly, disabled, and all kinds of care that are happening in broken systems, in hostile systems, etc. Our contribution to this debate is to extend and immerse this labor or this figure of the carer, going beyond an acknowledgement that care is labor, and also that care is extremely tied with the emotional and imaginal life aspects of our embodied life, to go back to the previous presentation. But also, and crucially, care is enmeshed in private property relation. And this is a key problem to think through for us. So in the book, to put it quickly, or in the project, we were in the end having conversations repeatedly around the way private property kind of locks care into a matrix of that basically has dimension of legal tools. Hence, the necessity of looking at piracy, hacking, tinkering, finding workarounds that comes from militant care practices, because the laws are, in the last decades, moving towards a consistent criminalization of independent and alternative care systems or structures and infrastructures. Then there is a dimension of knowledges. We wanted to acknowledge to which extent most research is privately owned. Knowledges are beyond paywalls. Our institutions encourage this to a degree that can be described as nauseating. Most research that gets funded has to promise a very quick return on investment. So property, again, colors and taints a lot of the knowledges that we can share and how we can share them and who can be in those rooms having these conversations. And finally, there is a question around technology, which we understand broadly to encompass tools and techniques and resources, but anything that has to do with some kind of like prosthetically augmenting our capacity to care that goes beyond embodied skills. And this is also a part that many scholars that look at care practices invite us to be attentive to, how much tools, techniques, and technologies shape horizons and possibilities of care. And how much of this is today, again, locked into a matrix of private property relations. I don't need to explain, I think, not to this room. Right? So the final, the ending of the argument also goes into an invitation, a more speculative invitation to also consider then how private property is also in our intimate lives resurfacing yet once more, inviting us to invest our lives into the form of heteronormative cisgender couple and family, which is kind of overlapping intensively with domestic and domesticated spaces of care, which are gendered accordingly. And so we are really considering other practices of kinning, reframing them as forms of mutiny, where we need collectivities of affect that go beyond better service conditions or imagining more effective infrastructures at scale, but also are able to talk about maybe a more intimate and affective dimension of what a care struggle might look like. So this is pretty much the topic of the project. Now, the process that we did, it started a while ago now, and it feels longer because of the hiatus that the COVID pandemic introduced in everyone's biographies. Although I'm always tempted to say, I don't think we learned much from COVID pandemics yet. It might never be too late, but it feels like the normal has kicked in again a bit. In any case, I'll be curious to hear if people in the room relate, but definitely it's my experience. So the project was offered in the form of syllabus, collectively produced syllabus, a very speculative exercise, but also a reflective moment. It was co-written by around 20 different activists, practitioners, and artists involved in various ways into disobedient care practices. And in the syllabus, what we did was also to provide alongside different sessions. Oh, sorry, I meant to say this much earlier, but you might see in the screen that one of the sessions and topics is indeed the hologram that back in the days in 2019 was just starting off, I think, or maybe had a couple of years in its back. So Cassie is a long-term, friend, collaborator, and I say hi to her. Anyway, so this mapping includes also a number of resources that we liberated. So clicking on the syllabus, and as you play with the website, you'll find it quite easily. There is also a fully open library of all the quotes that, or most of the books and articles that are involved in this syllabus. So this was our little symbolic gesture towards imagining how to go beyond private property relations as a mediators of care. So this has been the trajectory for the past years. There have been many conversations, meetings, gatherings, and after the book next year, I'll just say that we are very much now in the process of trying to make a gathering happen, which is probably going to be somewhere in the southeast of Europe, undefined, probably somewhere in between a camping resort and or like a camping gathering and a school, like a popular pedagogy school. And we're gathering some resources to make that happen, and then to see what might be useful in terms of the actual communities that found resonance with what the proposal of the project and the research was. And in the meanwhile, the second thing that I can share with you, just to anchor a bit my ramblings, is the prequel of Pirate Care project, which I just closed, called Figure It Out, The Art of Living Through System Failures, which was a different kind of, a very different process, which I should say it started off by the Yugoslavian expression that in English sounds as figure it out, comrade, and in Yugoslavian sounds as znaži se druže. These expressions means to find your workaround, your little way to obtain something a little bit illegally or under the table, or hacking a little bit a system or a law, etc. So it's an interesting expression because actually it started with the partisans, the Yugoslavian partisans of Tito during the war against the Nazis occupation and the Italian fascists. And often these young partisans were tasked with very difficult guerrilla action missions. And they would ask, but how do I do that? And often the answer would be, well, you figure it out, comrade. And then later on, during the socialist Yugoslavian times, it stayed on as a colloquialism to talk about all kinds of ways of cheating the system, maybe getting smuggled goods from Trieste, the jeans that were not available, or maybe stealing a little bit of cement from the the public construction site because you were building a little improvement to your own home. So we started there, and then we realized that there are so many expressions in many languages that talk about this capacity of the most oppressed amongst us, especially. But I think it's a very interesting faculty of intelligence to respond to systems that are broken or hostile by design, by trying to see how you can cheat them, or you can lie to them, or you can steal from them. And the starting point, so when I say we, I should also briefly mention that I will not maybe engage fully in the credits, but this Figure It Out was a bigger research collective, which included maybe 20 people, and it was supported with a larger grant. So we were working together for 2 years. And what we did in terms of the practice was to start to have a series of bonfires events, which wherever possible were actually including a fire to tend to, which I think is a wonderful thing. I always recommend it to people who organize gatherings, have a fire, it's really great. But other times didn't. But anyway, the point was they were unplugged events where we would share stories. There were storytelling sessions where we as researchers visiting a locale, which would always anyway come through affective geographies or kind of longer commitments in a specific place. We would bring our stories, like a suitcase of stories of how others have been cheating systems. And then this usually kind of divulged into a full-on discussion around illegalisms and local practices of illegalisms. And this is all unplugged. But in the book, most of the stories are printed as blackout poetry because, thank you. I'm not sure why I couldn't share my screen before, but if you scroll down, you can see, it looks a bit like a CIA thing in the end. I don't know, anyway. But yeah, so we pretty much early on understood that, at least in our case, interviews were not a way to understand the ways in which harm happens or how survival happens or thrival happens. So it was much better to know the truth through fiction and through imagination rather than go at it straight on. And also one realization we had was that it's very, there is a disconnect with the willingness to bring what this material might stand for into a public sphere, and the very concrete feeling that the public sphere is fraught and it was never inclusive and universal to begin with. So we were, for a while now, very much engaged with this ethics of refusal kind of discussions, which started in cultural anthropology, in ethnography. And this means basically a number of techniques whereby researchers decide with the communities and the constituencies that they work with what kind of informations can be shared and how. And this is very much, it's not a matter of saying no or keeping knowledge is for the privileged few, but it's really about reclaiming the conditions under which one can be heard, not assuming transparency as kind of an entitlement to knowledge that I think in fields connected with academic and para-academic public intellectual life are often taken for granted. Yeah, how am I doing with time? I think I can probably wrap up, but I can't see faces, so I don't.
Yeah, I mean, you have a couple of minutes.
Okay. I'm happy to stay with this even less. But yeah, I suppose both projects, what they maybe just one more thing. There is so I've been doing work mainly thinking with social movements for quite a long time, and one of the things that I've been saying to people that comes out for me from the pirate care years and the figure it out kind of conversations is that whatever is next in terms of political commitment and imagination will have a very different feel than the stories that we receive of the glorious 60s and 70s, where, you know, the feminists were rioting, you know, anti-colonial movements were, you know, changing the world. There was so much energy in terms of also working on our libidinal drives and re-understanding what are our kind of implications intimately. And so I feel that our starting point today in across the projects is much more one of hesitation and unglamour, and it doesn't feel as heroic as a barricade, none of that sort. But I suppose I'd like with these projects to find ways to create some some perception of excitement as the one that maybe we need to that comes with images that we might want to like set aside for the times we're in. Yeah, so maybe I'll end on this, and I look forward to the discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Can I ask speakers to come back around the table? Yeah, thank you so much for all of your contributions. I feel like there's too much to talk about. We're gonna open up to discussion between the questions. Does anyone have anything they'd like to know? Otherwise, I can.
I have a quick question on for Evie about what you said about children being the most oppressed groups. Who was that quote from again?
I am a good fellow. That was an easy question.
I think we maybe have someone online as well, and please do post questions in the chat. But seeing as I'm speaking and I want to ask you all questions, I'm interested in, we've kind of variously discussed like militant disobedient care systems, alternative protocols, burnout, how we might counter burnout in spaces of organizing. And then at the same time, and especially I think within our first three presentations today, talked about defining a crisis and a lack within the kind of offer from the state, I guess. And I'm interested in hearing from all of you really about how we can do both of these things at once. So practice pirate care and also make demands for state care whilst feeling not very hopeful about what that might be. And I suppose I think a few of you have maybe used the framing of the undercommons and Moten and Hani today, and I think it's an interesting tension between how they speak about planning and policy, and how do we both do the work that is necessarily happens outside of those kind of grander infrastructures, because it's the work that we do to survive, and also make demands on those at the same time.
Yeah, so I like how you phrased it, because I guess there's often a tendency to frame everything in very binary terms. So we're either practicing pirate care, or we're kind of, making demands for state care, and often, specific movements, individuals, groups are doing both at the same time. So I guess, but there are obviously points where those two things are contradictory, and actually that, I think that's what I'm really interested in, is the point at which, as you say, kind of policy making actually becomes something that gets in the way of realizing reproductive justice or other kinds of fair justice. So I think it's like, I guess in principle, there isn't always necessarily a tension, but I think in practice, sometimes there really are. So I think in a way it's about being precise, isn't it? And rather than necessarily talking quite grand terms about strategy, it's actually thinking about really particular kind of issues or problems or practices, and where there might be tensions. So that's kind of what I want to do in my next project, is really trace that. But I also think, I suppose that the term we haven't talked about at all is rights. And I think that might be a kind of part of the puzzle, because something I'm thinking about with reproductive justice is the kind of original framing of the reproductive justice model or framework is in terms of rights, and particularly human rights. And thinking about it in terms of human rights tends to come along with a certain kind of set of international institutional structures. But also thinking about rights tends to come along with a kind of assumption of a state which guarantees those rights. And for the reproductive justice activists and theorists like Loretta Ross, what they're trying to really push back against is a certain way of thinking about reproductive politics in terms of negative rights. Okay, so in that formulation, the state is something that we need to, get out of our uterus, or whatever, those banners that everyone holds. And so they were trying to get us to think in terms of positive rights, which places a duty upon the state to create the conditions in which people can meaningfully exercise the rights that they hold. And that's obviously emerging at a particular time and place. So it's in the 1990s in the US, particularly in relation to the Hyde Amendment and how that's affected reproductive healthcare and so on. Whereas I think now newer formulations of reproductive justice in different contexts, that there's less rights talk. And so that's what I'm interested in really, is how it is in those kind of different framings, and how reproductive justice then becomes kind of reimagined away from a rights-based model. And then what happens to the state, because the state isn't invoked in the same way as the kind of potential guarantor of those positive rights. So yes, I don't know if that's an answer to what you were talking about, but I think it's that tension between kind of policy and planning that you brought out that I think is really interesting for me.
I wonder if we just pick up in terms of thinking about the state in a particular historic period. So in the post-war reproductive period, the state being incredibly involved in developing a national health service, the way in which I think maybe the key word here is responsibility. Who is responsible? And in terms of the specific context of care for older adults, the responsibility was buffeted between the National Health Service and local authorities from the very beginning of our imagination of what national health care looked like. And I think that's a problem we still find to this day, or at least I personally have confronted with care for older adults in my own family. Who is responsible? Who, in terms of these state rights, are we speaking to? Who can help? Who can be the point of call? Being able to advocate for yourself within those structures is incredibly difficult, and being heard is incredibly difficult as well. So I think, I was just dropping out what you were saying about rights, and that's a really important thing. And then this is a slightly different tack, but also, again, thinking maybe from a more historic literary perspective, the temporality of these crises that we are meeting, a crisis indicates a sort of point in time where it's got the worst it could possibly be. But I think the crises of care has been something that has been undulating for many, many years. And there are certain crisis points we keep hitting, but I don't know how we get through onto the other side of that. And I think for me, listening to people talk about pirate care, hologram, burnout in social movements, it's incredibly important to also think about the way in which we have to have stamina in these situations. And yeah, I think temporality, politics is a really important part of this conversation as well.
I was just thinking off the back of that as well in terms of stamina, whether it should be any one person or one group's responsibility to do both. Yeah, there's something about like so 3 Pleats of Colour. I realised my background was in the charity industrial complex, and I worked in the gender based violence sector for most of my career, and burnt out prolifically in that space because of how much harm existed there. And my role in those organisations across South Yorkshire was to challenge and try and make those organisations more equitable. And I realised after those 10 years, it was a long period to realise this, but that that space wasn't safe for me, so therefore I couldn't do that work. And it wasn't, and there were many points where I had to question if staying in those spaces was even viable because of how unsafe it felt for me as a Black queer person, and having to witness so much harm that sector actually perpetrates. So I feel like everyone, as individuals, we will all have different capacities to being able to confront that harm, and it's really difficult to imagine both this like generational future where you know, but in terms of land justice, there's a really interesting and I'm gonna mess it up, but in terms like the big wealthy landowners with properties like Chatsworth House and whatever, there is kind of like a legal loophole which ensures that that property will be in their generation, in their family for generations, and the everyday person doesn't have any form of security, whether material, financial, housing, yeah, pick a thing that allows us to feel secure about the future for that long in advance. So I think there's some of us who are best placed to be doing that work and to be really focusing all our time, all our space, all our energy into that imagination work. Meanwhile, other people are fighting and navigating the systems as they are now, and to not lose sight of both of those things, which I think can be really easy to do. I know can be really easy to do in practice, because from that kind of policy point of view, it becomes this like tunnel vision where you end up fighting for the most minuscule of changes. And this is where abolition comes into it, of whether we are just wasting our time fighting for those minuscule changes in the grand scheme of things. And actually, would it be easier to just abolish the law and start again? And there's a quote by Toni Morrison where she writes, I'm going to mess it up, but something along the lines of the biggest distraction, that the biggest consequence of racism is distraction, that it keeps us focusing time and time again on our own survival and fighting to be seen as worthy of the institutions and the spaces that already exist, when actually would it not be a much better use of our time and energy to just start again and to build something for ourselves that works for ourselves. So that's certainly where I find Pleats of Colour sitting, whilst also recognising that there are people for many different reasons, resource and privilege, capacity, that are much better placed to be doing that work of negotiating the safety in the present while we build the safety in the future.
I think there's a lot of overlap with what you've said with some of the work I've been doing with parents. So, there's two scholars in particular who are at Sheffield, I think, Catherine Coveney and Sarah Ryan. And they've been talking about this in terms of mother activism and disabled children for a long time. And what you see is there's generations and generations of mothers who try and fight and try and change the system. And, you know, they think in telling our stories, we can get this changed. We can fight for a more just and more less ableist society for our children. And then as their children grow up, they start to fight for changes in adult social care. And then a new generation of mothers come and then they discover it's so unjust, and the cycle just continues and nothing changes. It's these small incremental changes. And they argue for an unmothering. So we need to have somebody, we need to have collective responsibility for doing that work. It can't always fall to the community, to those people to be the voice when you're trying to survive in those spaces. So
I was thinking about, I mean, so many things, but Joanna Hedva has this kind of amazing quote, like, about, like, the earth is our hospital. And I guess I was thinking about how different it would be if we felt that, like, we lived within a healthcare system rather than the healthcare system being like a small sector within the economy. And yeah, I think it did something interesting to my imagination to just like to walk myself through that. And I think it is like an abolitionist idea, I think, in some ways, because like it's like basically the healthcare system is a financialized system, and it is basically built on like different forms of like power and profit. And yeah, I guess I kind of started to think about like what it would be like if we felt that we were a part of the healthcare system, what we would do to create the conditions so that we could be in it. And so like just speaking from the holograms perspective, like if we imagined that within a healthcare system, like all the caregivers would have to be cared for, that might be the work of regular people to make sure that like there isn't a kind of like a hospital or a doctor that we go to withdraw care from, but that like we as society make sure that the people that are doing care work have support. And then yeah, and then that means it really changes the landscape. And then I was thinking about how like a lot of what we do in the hologram for people is like people with really urgent like medical or any kind of care needs. Like there's a lot of work that we do just to make sure that people believe that they deserve care, and then give them the kind of support so that they then feel that they have like the energy to go and get it. And yeah, I think that it's sort of like I feel like the idea of living within a healthcare system, or like letting like society be a healthcare system, or a place that actually produces care. It's really like a two-sided change. Like one is like like demanding that all caretakers are cared for, but also like sort of changing our sense of like our own value, that we deserve care, and that I don't know how to say that, but and then I guess it would kind of dissolve the difference between like in disability justice, I think people talk a lot about like creating a world where you're constantly giving and receiving care, and I think this is the kind of thing that would have to change. So it wouldn't be like us versus them in a way. And then the last thing I wanted to say was that like I love this social worker named Vicki Reynolds, and I feel like you might also love her. And I love her description of burnout, which is it's like trying to do good work within an unethical system. It creates burnout. And I think that this is a big like, this is my main experience of a medical system, is that like everyone's trying to do really good work within a really fucked up system, and so then everybody gets burned out. So I do think that like, I don't know if she identifies as an abolitionist, but she kind of is. Yeah, I just imagine that like, if the earth is our hospital, like, it's like, then our demands for care or our work within that hospital or that place of care, like, is different, because then we're not working against it, like we're working together with it, in like a kind of more of like an ecosystem way.
I think Valeria maybe wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks. What to say? I'm not sure that the state versus the state is a well-posed question for the days we're living in. Maybe it's useful for others, but let me just say why I don't find it like maybe a place where I can start reasoning. So I think we're very clear that we're witnessing a very violently, brutally real rise of the anti-systemic far right globally. So these are people that love to say that we should have less state. And basically what they want the state to wither away to create space for is tech financial capitalism, right? So most of this, so I'm not a, even though my background, I was trained as a political theorist, I guess, but I think this question of the state and what it is that we mean by that means various things to various people and experiences. But I suppose that one other thing that seems relevant to mention here is that a lot of the functions that we think of as mediated by law and bureaucracy and an office where you go negotiate with a bureaucrat are actually now embedded in tech. They're fully automatized. There's no one to complain to. There's nowhere to hide. You either click or not click. If you refuse the terms of services, you do not exist. It's extremely difficult for me to understand again when we think of this layer of techno-mediated care. Where is the state and where is the private, or where is the public sphere, where is the civil society? I don't know. Insert your favorite general actor. So yeah, I suppose that not having a good answer to this in more concrete terms, I find that very inspiring movements and that have been doing both at the same time, aka laying claims and demands to the public sector, let's call it like that, in terms of resources and legitimacy and legality and visibility. And at the same time, they could do that because their demands came from a place of organizing outside of it and in opposition to it. So one would be the Black Panthers. And for example, they were, as they were setting up free clinics across the US, they were also very much supporting the young lords occupying Lincoln Hospital being run in a very abhorrent way of neglect and disservice. And for example, another example that I find helpful is the Italian movement of radical psychiatrists that actually led to the closure of the asylum as an institution in Italy. And many of these people were actually working in the mental health system of the state. But basically, as soon as they were named whatever director of a department or so, they would abolish in the American inflected language. They would call it deinstitutionalize, which is a mouthful in English, but in any case, the ethos is exactly the same. They would make laws, they would literally sign off the papers to free their patients and to let them run the hospital through General Assembly and beyond. And that's a whole story. But so these two examples is like, I think we have a lot of range of tools and strategies that are not just reformist, insistent into burnout. But at the same time, I don't know, I would hesitate to just let go of the state, even though it's becoming mainly a tool for being used for punitive uses. Basically, there is like this new moralization of everything. But yeah, that's where I'm at, sorry. Not very hopeful.
Yeah, just thinking then as well, the women's liberation movement is a good example there with the ambivalent relations to the state, with the kind of demand for state provision of refuges or something, but that's coming from very much a position outside.
Yeah, I think like that's a really good example of how risky it can be to be in a position where you're in need of state support and asking for state support, and it's a whole history between, especially in the UK, like the domestic abuse support and rape crisis centre support, and also radical Black movements and organising, and how particularly in the 70s and 80s the state saw how they could manipulate these radical movements through state intervention into essentially needing their funding. And I think this is why I think this is why gender violence spaces are so violent themselves now, because they are so indebted to and in need of state funding that they can no longer provide the radical care and support needed. I used to work in an organisation called Ashiana, I'm just going to name them, in Sheffield, that was supposed to be quote unquote a BAME organisation, not that I like that language, and they got the majority of their funding from the Home Office. So when they were supporting refugees and asylum seekers, they were doing so under the orders and under the direct funding of the Home Office. So there's no way that those organisations can't be harmful if they are being funded by a hateful state, essentially. And similarly with Black organising, the amount of competition that we now see in Black organisers for funding and this move towards representation politics is a direct consequence of the state seeing really radical organising and finding very tactical ways of pitting us against each other and putting us in competition. So there's like no shortage of histories where we can look back and see that actually a relationship with the state in many ways, in big and small ways, never really serves us. Any questions? Online, there's a couple of messages there, but I don't know if they're just. Did you scroll down?
People have to dash off, yeah.
I think there's been like lots to absorb, and I just want to say thank you to everyone, because I think it's listening that we can learn. And I mean, I think I felt like I was coming from quite a historic context, but actually I can see how it builds and relates, and there's so much to think about. So yeah, I think it's thank you. A comment, not a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if any of our speakers also want to respond to what each other has said, or if we should.
I think what you said was so important, because it really reminds us to periodize and specify, doesn't it? Time, place is really important. Thinking about the NHS, but that's for another day.
Maybe I would just say I think that struggle is just care and struggle need to be much more proximate, and I loved this killing as mutiny that Valeria brought in. And I just thought, this I think there is something that has happened over time through the defunding of care by the state in everywhere that has meant that the pressure of care gets privatized inside of the home. And so that like there's so much bound up in like you take care of each other in the home, or you take care, or you go to hide your care needs in the hospital. And that like the space between those two places is big and vast and sort of silent and I think filled with shame. And I just think that like I had to really sit with this idea of kinning as mutiny, but like after maybe like 2 minutes, I was like, oh yeah, totally. Like I actually think that sort of like deprivatizing care, like making it something that is accessible and like that we feel kind of like ownership over, and that it's a part of our lives, but not in an extractive way, but in like a kind of creative way. It feels really important. And one thing that I think like Valeria also brought up is just like the relationship between care and gender, and like the ways that I think many people are raised to believe like not only that it's not their job to produce care, but that like maybe they're not supposed to. I think there's just like there's so much kind of like interpersonal like work and play to do to kind of undo some of the habits that we have accrued around care. And yeah, and it's all kind of struggle, and it goes from like really like private small struggles to like very big collective struggle. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, I think Cassie's work has really spoken to me. So some of the work I was talking to someone earlier, I was doing a focus group with parent carers last week, and it was 4 mothers of disabled children, and the conversation shifted to one who said, I'm a single mother and I've got 4 children, and we were on a video call and she was doing the care for her child while we were talking, and she was getting her baby ready, putting it in the bush. I'm just going to go for a walk while we're talking in the focus group. And we were watching her do this care as she was multitasking, telling us about her care on the focus group, and she started to say, well, how are you doing it? She said, I have to do it. I'm a single mother. And it opened this conversation about gender and about care, and they were all mothers, and they started to reflect, actually all of them, on how they don't ask for help. Nobody helps them because they feel like this is their job. And they started to talk, well, my husband works and he doesn't really do any of this, and I'm on my own. And they started to, it was almost ingrained and taken for granted that nobody cares for them. They're the caregiver. And I think that's what's so powerful about your work is to just reflect back on that, and to think, actually, you know, caregivers need to be cared for, and who's going to do that? Who's going to do that work? So I think that's something I'm definitely going to take away from that.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Yeah, and like habits don't change individually either. It's like habits change collectively, and so like there is something about like it's like I hate self-help. I hate the rhetoric around self-help. But I think there's something about like setting patterns of asking for support and like allowing that to roll around communities so that more people can just do that. And like discuss needs. And I think that that's a part of kinning is like being vulnerable enough to share your needs and find out about other people's needs in lots of different contexts. And then to like work from there. Yeah.
I think what I liked about your project, just to kind of add to that as well, is how the creation of structure, and so how you talked about it in terms of, you know, really quite formal structures, set times, set patterns, rituals. And so how you describe the hologram then appears as this very kind of formal, orderly system of care compared to kind of state institutionalized forms of care. Like I'm just thinking about the NHS now, thinking about the UK, that then appears in comparison like just completely chaotic and disorderly. But it's not how we often think, right? So usually more kind of anarchic forms are framed as being chaotic, disorderly in comparison to state organized. So I felt like you completely flipped that, and I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it.
Sorry, can I just make what I think your statement about who cares for the carer is really, really important. So I've been a carer for 16 years, first for my mum, now for my partner. But I'm also a community projects leader and a PhD researcher as well. And we've just initiated a program, a creative program for caregivers. So we decided that we could support caregivers through not just, you know, bog standard creative activities, but by doing something much more interventionist or engaging in a very different way through contemporary art. So I've been working with a performance company called Jade in London, and they used applied theatre to ask carers to think more creatively about their role within the home, because it's within the home that the crisis is taking place. And there's a big difference between the micro and the macro. So I care very deeply about caring within the world. In my own home, I get very resentful about having to care. I refuse to let it consume me, and then I feel guilty that I refuse to let it consume me. And I know from my experience within a community centre, there's so many women, especially, feeling that way. And you were talking a little earlier about how people are fighting for their rights, and maybe that's a displaced use of energy and sharing their stories and things. But we find that by becoming a story depository, if you like, where people chuck their stories in and they say, there's my story, log it in, and they go off and they feel a little bit more released from something. And so I think storytelling is important. I think sometimes fighting for your rights is a displacement activity for the thing itself, because you're so tired and fed up, and by fighting for something, it sort of gives that role of purpose in a way. But yeah, so I just wanted to share what we've been doing.
And I think you're exactly right. So something I found is that these kind of crises are so individualized, and people almost don't talk about them and don't share them, and they think this is just me and how I'm coping, and I'm in crisis and I'm burnt out and all I can do is survive. And when they sit together and everybody starts telling the same story, it's quite cathartic. But then suddenly realise, oh, this is not me and my problem. This is a bigger structural, social, societal problem, and maybe there's something we can do. And I think it's kind of hopeful in a way.
And using, you know, creative strategies or tropes or whatever. I mean, we did a big session using shadow puppetry. So we were using shadow as a trope to cast light on the role of the carer, because it had lots of metaphorical potential. And we found that, oh, yeah, I am in the shadows, you know, so you've got this conversation going, but it was also very creative and very stimulating as well. And I love the phrase figure it out. And one of my participants we were doing some monoprinting, and he wrote go figure, and it made me really laugh at the time, but it is what most people are doing, they're figuring it out. So yeah, but thank you, I've really found today really stimulating.
There is one question in the chat, I'll just read it out. How would you be able to judge when there's an aspect of your life that you are overcommitted to, and hence provide an excessive level of care, when it's in your best interest to give less care, and in what way?
Maybe goes back to emotion, like checking in, how do we feel, instead of always thinking, as Evie was talking about, which will be, you know, different to every person that feels and thinks. But yeah, maybe that's how I personally. Do I check in enough? Probably not, but you know.
Yeah, I'd say the same, like there's an embodied element to it that I think I have found in many people in my ecosystems and beyond is lacking. That when I was interviewing many of the people who are many of the people are organisers, and are organising around this idea of burnout and social justice issues that could contribute to it. But then when I ask them if they're burnt out or have they ever been burnt out or when was the last time they were burnt out, they could almost get quite defensive and say, oh no, I've never been burnt out, blah, blah, blah. Then when you unpick it, actually, yes, they are. And they get to, and when we looked at redefining burnout and what would it look like with this lens and that lens, then actually most people came to a conclusion of like, oh, well, yeah, if you're saying it in that way, then yes, I am. And often we do like an exercise that would be, yeah, there's many different kinds that you can do, that whether that's visualization or kind of an emotive movement practice that allows you to just take stock of where you're at and where you're really at when you pause and when you're not moving all the time and on the go all the time. How are you really? And I don't think many of us get the opportunity to ask ourselves that. What do we really need? If we were to be fully resourced, what would we do? What wouldn't we do if we could, if we felt like we could drop it? So often, because we're being so detached from this embodied knowing, it becomes really hard to identify and pinpoint exactly when we're at that point of breaking point. So many of us, particularly those of us who've experienced traumas, and in the book I talk about, there's actually a lot of data research which interestingly has never really seen the public light of day, that shows that burnout impacts the brain exactly as trauma does. So actually when we're in that traumatized state, which we know will be a lifelong recovery, those of us in survival mode will keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing and keep going. And actually it's unlearning those survival mode tactics and allowing ourselves to just be. And the more we're able to be in our bodies as it is, the more we're able to identify whether we like who we are in that moment, and then adjust around it. And I think the like neoliberal version of self-care, which self-care was originally a Black feminist practice, but then capitalism, consumerism, face masks and spa days got their claws on it. But through that kind of neoliberal lens, individualistic lens, we're told that once we can identify what our needs are, we are then meant to drop everything despite whether or not it would impact someone else. And actually, the community care and mutual aid model would, very similar to what you were saying as well, but ensuring that we're all cared for, so that when one of us needs a minute, whatever that minute looks like, and depending on the state of crisis you're in, that minute could look like weeks, months, years, but that us needing to negotiate our capacities doesn't then have a ripple effect on someone else. So that has to be also something we're really conscious of as we're edging towards understanding our embodied states better. Yeah. But yeah, I found the question quite interesting in itself of that being able to judge when something, almost, yeah, that idea that it's a cognitive thing of like, oh yeah, I'm doing too much washing up now, I need to stop doing this washing up, when actually often it will be a cumulative amount of things, and we having to identify what needs to be placed down for the time being. And I think the more I lean into embodied practices, the more I'm able to identify specifically, oh, it's this that doesn't feel good. And again, when we talk about like the future building and what we're building out of the ruins, how do we know what we're going to build if we don't know what feels good? And so many of us only know what badness feels like, what survival feels like, what trauma feels like, what burnout feels like. So actually these experimentations and practices allow us to identify what feels good now, so that we know when we've reached that point of, okay, we no longer need to be fighting, it's because we feel it, we feel that we're safe. Yeah, rambling answer.
Thank you.
We're all feeling a bit tired.
Yeah. Yeah, if no one has any burning questions or comments, I think we'll finish there. But yeah, just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today and everyone for coming. And yeah, I think hopefully these conversations at Loughborough will continue. So
Can we say thank you to you as well?
yeah.